Welcome to Beyond Movement Project. My name is Matthew Philly, husband, father, entrepreneur, and it's my mission to bring you people who are doing incredible things that will help you reach your next level. Join me as I look beyond movement to discover how we can become the most powerful version of ourselves. Let's go. What is up, Beyond Movers? If there is one thing that holds us back from pursuing our dreams and reaching our next level, it is fear. Whether you're afraid of public speaking, ridicule, judgment, failure, or any form of negative attention, oftentimes this is what holds us back from moving forward. Today's guest is one of the most successful alpinists on the planet. He has experienced over 20 expeditions to the Himalayas' tallest mountains and has been face to face with death more times than most could even imagine. Today, we will find out what it takes to continue to move forward in the presence of even your deepest fears and how to not let them hold you back. This is a deep conversation that covers many topics from stress management to death to his experience with Russian conspiracies. So hold on to your hats because this guy has some serious stories to tell. This is episode 4 with Don Bowie. All right, Don Bowie, man, super excited about this. Dude, you were insanely fun to research. And that's actually one of my criterias when I bring a guest onto the show. I want to make sure that they're interesting. I'm going to be excited to research this person, but I also need to make sure that they're going to be a valuable guest in terms of my audience as well. We want to make sure that there's something there that this guest is going to be able to bring value to the audience. And you were absolutely on that criteria for sure. So you have an insanely impressive resume of experiences. And in my opinion, a very close relationship with death, which is something that I kind of want to have a conversation with you about because there's so much fear for a lot of people surrounding death, right? So before we get into any of that, I'd love to dive into my first question, which is how did you get involved and started into such a dangerous, risky, exhilarating sport? So maybe start off by explaining what your sport is and how you got involved in it.
Sure. So my sport would be best labeled as high altitude alpinism. So I'm a high altitude climber alpinist. Alpinist has a bit of a distinction over general mountaineering. We can talk about that a little bit, but I got into it very organically. And I could explain more what it is by just telling you the process. So I just started I grew up in Canada. I spent a lot of my childhood in Alberta. We were kind of feral children there. You know, mom opened the door and let us out back and just said, be back by dinner. So we were always playing in the fields and in the forest and not far from the mountains. And every time my parents took me to the mountains, I just remember really feeling something different. Like it was something that I wanted to be in, and it was wilderness. It wasn't just mountains. It was just, I wanted to be out there. And so when I got old enough, I started hiking, started buying some equipment, looking through magazines, Canadian Tire and stuff, and buying stuff that I thought that I'd be able to go into the woods with. So it was just about wilderness at that point. And slowly I started hiking. And then it was, wow, that hill looks pretty good. I want to go to the top of the hill. It was scrambling at that point to get to the highest point. And then once I was at the highest point, I could see higher mountains in the distance. And so it was more about getting to a destination than it was about climbing in itself. But over the years, that has just pushed me to try harder and harder things, you know, so to get to the top of that mountain. But it was really the love of wilderness and the love of mountains that got me out there. First of all, it wasn't a sport, but at the same time, as I was in high school, I was really an athlete. I was playing football. I was racing, downhill skiing. This is back in Ontario now in high school. And I played rugby for York County. And athletics was really a big part of my life at that point. So when I started to get into later in life, when I was just mostly hiking in the backcountry, now it was not just about getting to that point. Now it was about how fast can I get to that point. And so I started to combine athletics with being in the backcountry. So most people think about climbing or mountaineering as an adventure sport. So or as so hiking, it's not really athletic. And my sport really combines athleticism in the highest and hardest mountains of the world. And so it's really pushing the bounds of human limitations in some of the most unexplored parts of the world. So you have the deepest oceans and some of the highest mountains, which are really the frontier of exploration. But it's not just about adventure, it's about athleticism, pushing the bounds of human possibility. And that includes like climbing without supplemental oxygen, training like an endurance athlete, an elite athlete to get to those points. So that's the story of how I kind of got to where I am right now and what I'm doing right now, climbing in the highest mountains in the world, Himalayas, South America, Pakistan, really remote areas, in really exploratory climbing as fast and light as possible.
Okay, so you were mentioning that you've kind of always felt drawn to wilderness, going outdoors and just being surrounded by nature. That's always been something that's kind of pulled you. So, as you started getting more into hiking, climbing, getting to higher peaks, have you found that you've never really had like a fear of heights, or
Oh
has
no.
it never?
Oh no, I'm terrified of heights.
Oh, you are really
Oh
interesting.
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
I'm scared of heights. That's just something that if you're not scared of heights, you're in denial. I mean, if you're not afraid, well, that's just one of the many objective things that you're afraid of out there. But no, I'm afraid of heights. But it's one of those things. So when you first were talking about like what I do, what were some of the words that you used? I can't remember. Risky. What were some of the other words that you used?
Exhilarating, dangerous.
Auxiliary. Yeah. So it's interesting when you look at what if you look at risk and fear. I know we're going to get into this eventually, but if you really look at what I do, and if you took somebody and you said, okay, you've never driven a Formula One race car before, you drop somebody in a Formula One race car and you say, drive around at 200 miles an hour, 220 miles an hour, how fast those guys go, they would crash. They would be I mean, I'd be terrified doing that. But when you go through years and years and years of slowly, incrementally increasing your exposure, the body adapts, the mind adapts to that kind of fear. And it's the same with heights. If you just went to the top of El Cap and looked over 4,000 feet down, it's terrifying. I'm scared. I mean, my heart, I feel really, really afraid up there. But if you start climbing at the bottom and slowly introduce yourself to that exposure, your mind makes those adaptations over time. So, I just didn't jump into this, quote, risky sport. So I've transitioned into it, and the experience is the same when you're on an expedition. When you first get there, it's quite intimidating, but after you're exposed to those kind of objective dangers, you make those adaptations, and it's amazing. The human body is incredibly resilient, and the human mind is very flexible and resilient.
Yeah, I absolutely love that because it can be related to so many different things, right? Like you can apply that to business, life, you can apply that to athletics, you can apply it really to anything, right? Like overcoming obstacles. And essentially, the sport that you do is basically like, I mean, I guess you could kind of say this about any sport, but really, alpine and climbing, summiting mountains is like the pinnacle of overcoming obstacles, right?
Yeah, problem solving,
Yeah.
overcoming self-doubt, fear. It's a very internalized process for sure. I sometimes try to walk people through, I use the same, you've heard of familiarity breeds contempt, but I have changed that a little bit with familiarity breeds exempt. And let me give you an example of that. So you have a lot of two-lane highways that we drive down. Driving down a two-lane highway is an incredibly dangerous thing. But we've done it so many times that we don't see that if we just swerve a few meters, to the left, our life is finished. Like that's really how close you are to death. And for a lot of people, that's the reality of today. It's going to happen today. But because we are so familiar with it, somehow we believe we're exempt from the risk. And so when I make that comparison to people, they think, well, I have to drive to work or I have to go on the road. It's still a choice that you have to make. and you're making a choice to do something that's incredibly risky, and a lot of people lose their lives doing that thing. But because we're so familiar with it, now we wouldn't call it risky. But if you took a cowboy from back in the late 1800s and put him in a car, he'd be terrified.
Right.
He's never gone that fast in his life. Just expose somebody who's never even been in a car before. I've met people in the Himalayas in northern Nepal who have never been in a car their entire lives, and there's a lot of people in the world who've never been in the car. And you put them in a car and drive, 120 in the opposite, while somebody's driving past you just a few meters away in the opposite direction, they'll see that risk, but we don't see it because we're familiar with it.
Yeah, that's huge. Again, like exposure, as you said, right? Like just being exposed to the risk for a longer period of time helps you feel a little bit more comfortable with it. So again, like that is so applicable to so many different struggles that you could be having in life, right? Like let's say somebody, first, like somebody loses their arm. That's a massive lifestyle change, right? Initially, it's going to take somebody so much mental strength, so much physical strength and willpower to learn how to do things without that arm. However, somebody who's lost that arm or have not had that arm now for 3, 4, 5 years, they're far more comfortable with this lifestyle. Yeah. And at this point, it might come much more naturally not to first try and reach for something with that arm, right? So similar to, let's say, athletic obstacles or business challenges and struggles, overcoming these issues at first can seem like a massive task, right? But as you become more comfortable with overcoming specific issues, you become desensitized to it in a way.
Yeah, so there's overcoming fear, but then there's another concept which we have to employ in the highest mountains in the world, because literally, so I just climbed Annapurna last year, which is, arguably one of the most dangerous mountains in the world statistically. And when you're running a gauntlet at that point, so there are certain points of the climb where you're under such objective danger, such hazards that are just like seracs, which are, for example, if you've seen those videos in Alaska where people go up on those tours and the glacier calves off into the ocean, that's what happens on the mountain. So you have these series of seracs all the way up above you on a near vertical face, and at any given time, one or more of them is collapsing, whether it's a small collapse or a large collapse, and you're climbing under this, weaving your way through it. Literally, it's a roll of the dice, and you know that. And people have gone before you, haven't made it through, and people are going to go try it after you haven't made it through. So, that's a terrifying thing, because it's not about your skill. It's not about you being able to master or control the environment. You're subject to that extreme risk, and you're running the gauntlet. It's just a total risk. So it's a terrifying thing. So people talk about overcoming fear, right? And fear is one of the things which we are most uncomfortable with. People, not only do we not want to be afraid, but we're afraid of being afraid of things, right? We're afraid of being afraid. Well, when you know this is going to be a part of it, when you accept that, I know in the future when I do this, I'm going to be terrified. I'm going to be afraid. And without being paralyzed by this fear, you do not overcome your fear. You must endure your fear. So courage is not the absence of fear. So people think, this movie Courage, where the guy's got furrowed brow, once more into the breach, dear friends, and they don't fear. They don't feel fear. But that's impossible. That's denial. That's just stupid. So you actually don't overcome your fear in these circumstances. You learn to be afraid and learn to be able to function while you're terrified and be afraid. So it's like any other discomfort that we endure. And if you cannot sit in your humanity at that point and realize the risk and objective danger and chew on it, that's the visual that I have when I'm on a mountain in that situation. I chew on it. I chew on my fear, sometimes shaking, but I still have to function in being afraid. And in the rest of life, I can avoid that kind of fear. I have so many insulators. I have my comfort zone, which I can push any number of buttons to get me back out of that fear. But in that situation, you can't eject yourself from that. Even if you decide to go down, it's such a involved process of objective danger on the way down that I've had that feeling a lot. I just want to go home. Maybe somebody has already died. There's the shit is hitting the fan, and I've been in that situation. And all I want to do is curl up in a fetal position and say, I want my mommy type thing. I mean, you really get to that place. And if you can't chew on your fear at that point and live in that discomfort with the fear, you're just going to die. And what's in alpinism, what's really interesting is at that point, when you feel that afraid, you have to continue to go up if you want to summit. So you have to continue deeper into that fear. Otherwise, as soon as you feel that objective fear on the mountain, that under that objective danger, you're just going to turn around. You'll never climb one of these mountains. You'll never get to the summit.
So you talk about
overcoming fear and sitting in your fear, accepting it, chewing on it. It's entirely different.
Yeah. So you were saying it's important to not be paralyzed by your fear. So
that's right.
Can you explain, like, what do you do in order to, or what have you done in order to get to the level that you're at now, to become, more comfortable with that sense of, clearly death is a very real possibility when you're up on the mountains, right? And that's one of the highest levels of fear for so many people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and that's just a natural thing to fear death. So how have you felt like you could overcome that and still perform at a level that, you need to perform at a specific level in order to avoid it, even, remotely, right? So
yeah.
do you have any tricks that you like to use in order to, when you're at that point where all you want to do is curl up into the fetal position, all you want to do is go home and lay down and just be in a comfortable position? Mm-hmm. Is there tricks that you like to use? Is it just like, is there specific mantras?
It's the same as, it's similar. So it's not to not, the goal is to not be afraid. The goal is to not be afraid, how I say that. So do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So most people look at something and say, how do I do this and not be afraid? That's courage. But that's just a lot of circumstances, including life, that's just denial. That's because to be afraid and to accept it as part of the process. To understand that courage is not the absence of fear, but to be able to sit in your fear and to be able to function while being afraid. There's a great distinction between those two things. And a lot of people view overcoming fear as getting rid of it. And so we live lives, trying to insulate ourselves from feeling fear. Fear is such it's such an outlier. It's something real true fear, like a fear of death, some people only experience a few times in their life. Right. And so it's kind of like practice. And I don't really want to encourage people just to go out and put themselves in risky situations, but I'm just telling you what the outcome is once you're placed in that situation over and over. The human mind and human body is incredibly resilient. And if we can only function while we're not afraid, we are extremely limited. So putting yourself in situations where you're tangibly afraid, it, even physically, adrenaline going through the roof, shaking a little bit, but still being able to function, make good decisions in that situation, is the only way that you're going to accomplish and reach your limit in your potential of what you're capable of doing. Because if your ceiling is, I'm too afraid, I can't do this anymore, that's not your limit of your physical or mental intellectual potential. It's only the ceiling of where you start being too uncomfortable. So fear is just like any other discomfort. You have to really look at it that way. So on a mountain, you have cold, extreme cold. So you're cold, you sleep shivering a lot of times. You're hypoxic, which means you're starved of oxygen at these extreme altitudes, because again, we don't climb with supplemental oxygen. You cannot, in a hypoxic state, one of the first processes to get ejected by your body is food metabolism. So you throw up, or you can't eat, you feel nauseous. So now you're starving. And then you have all these objective dangers around you, plus the fear of falling, because a lot of times we climb with minimal rope and minimal equipment. So you have all these circumstances, plus the endless objective dangers: rock fall, avalanches, serac fall, snow avalanches, falling into a crevasse, falling from your equipment failing or something like that. So all those things you have to look at as discomforts, and fear is just another one of those discomforts. So if I learn to be, one of the things that I find that's really crazy is that I live life hungry. I live life hungry. I mean, physically hungry, because I'm so familiar with the feeling of starvation. I'm so familiar with getting up in the morning, not eating anything for a long period of time, that here, when I'm 8 feet from a fridge, sometimes I'll get up and I'll work all day and I'll say, wow, I haven't even eaten yet. It's 6 o'clock and I haven't had a meal. I've had coffee because I can't live without the coffee, but but I haven't had a meal at 6 o'clock. And I think that's crazy. So I ask myself, people say, well, you're not hungry. No, I'm actually hungry. So I'm feeling the same feeling of hypoglycemia that anybody else, any other normal person would, but I'm just familiar with it. Fear is the same way. Once you live with that impending fear, and I mean fear of your life, and once you've gone through it, you become more familiar with it, and then you can function in it. So it's hard. You don't want to encourage. I don't really think it's wise to just say, well, go out and put yourself in practice fear by going out and putting yourself in super risky situations. But at the same time, look at the end result. And I give you an example of climbing K2. I climbed K2, one of the only Canadians to have climbed K2, and I did it without supplemental oxygen. And we were below the summit, and there was a couple people from another team. There was 14 people went for the summit that day from all over the world, different countries, and only 12 came back that particular day. And one of those guys was climbing in front of me at one point. We were following in the track, and you take turns putting a track in. And he was climbing on oxygen, and he was at one point about 30 or 40 feet above me, and all of a sudden I saw a little bit of movement, and he just fell past, right? So you just watch a guy fall to his death, and you're at this point about 8,300 meters, 8,400 meters. So you've got 200 meters to go to the summit. Well, at that altitude is, you're at the cruising altitude of jets, at that altitude. So it's very, very dangerous and tedious, very slow movement at that altitude. You're like in a little bit of a dream state because you're so hypoxic. So you have a guy that falls to his death. Well, what are you going to do? You can't rescue him. He's gone. You can't get to his body. You can't, even if you did at that altitude, you can barely survive. So you're not going to save that guy. So what do? Do you quit? Do you turn around? I mean, you have to make these decisions which are completely abnormal. You turn around and continue to go up, but at the same time, that's a horrific moment, a terrible moment, especially for a man, his family, his friends. It's an emotional moment, but at the same time, there's nothing you can do. At other times, you can do things for other people, and I've been part of a lot of rescues in my life. But at that particular time, once I saw what happened to that guy, I mean, he didn't survive that. It was very obvious. So that evoked a lot of fear inside you. So now, what kind of decisions do you make? How do you continue to move forward at that point? But we did, and we eventually ended up summiting.
That's incredible, man. And that reality for you as an alpinist, is that how you'd say it?
Alpinist, yeah.
Alpinist. So that's a reality, right? Like when you're getting ready to go on an expedition, you must kind of be prepared to see things like that. For a lot of people, that sounds completely surreal. Like, we'll never really have to experience watching somebody fall from a cliff and then just,
Hmm.
knowing that you just watch that person fall to their death. That's just incredible. Like, do you get completely desensitized to that stuff, or not completely desensitized, but somewhat desensitized to that stuff after so many years of, um, climbing these high mountains that clearly have a higher level of a death rate, right? Like, you must be
Hmm.
walking past um, bodies at some point. Do you
You
get
are, yeah.
desensitized do you ever get desensitized to seeing that, or is it always,
No.
you always have a sense of, you feel that in your heart?
I would say desensitized to it, because I think that that would be, um, I would be concerned if I ever became desensitized to the tragedy of death. However, I will give you a little bit of my perspective on it. I think there's some cultural influence, especially in the Western world, about death. And it's true when you're going to K2, where you have to cross a massive debris field where the avalanches scour the upper faces and bring down pretty much everything that's on the upper faces. And so when I was on K2, you would be walking as the season would go on. We were there for, I think, 2 months. And as the season would go on, the snow would melt and bring up all kinds of things that had come down in these avalanches. And you'd walk over and pick up a boot, and there'd be a sock coming out of a boot. And there's only one thing that keeps a sock in a boot, and that's a foot. And then you walk a little bit farther, and you'd see a jacket. You pick up a jacket, and an arm would fall out of the jacket. you know and I mean, I can tell you some like there's some crazy stuff you like on K2. True story, I got violently ill at base camp, violently ill. And to the point where I remember one night crawling to the crap tent, the toilet tent, the little tent. We have a little toilet tent, and you kind of make your base camp staff makes a little squat, with rocks, squat hole, and they put this little tent over it, which is just, I mean, one of the it's like a torture chamber in there, just to be in there, especially when the sun hits it. But you can imagine me trying to make it to this tent in the middle of the night, and like I just remember laying on the glacier, and every time I threw up, I just crap myself inside my pants, every time, and I'm just laying there throwing up and crapping myself at the same time. I mean, just violently ill from something I drank or ate. So when I got better, I went up and followed our little trickle of water, that melt water on the glacier, and I followed the source where it was coming from. And about 150 meters above camp, I came across a really disturbing sight. And what happens on these glaciers is the sun is really intense at that altitude, because you don't have the atmosphere to filter the sun. So if you set up a tent, the sun melts, even though it looks like rock, there's ice under it. And so the sun actually melts the glacier slowly. But your tent, it doesn't melt because it's shadow. There's a shadow under your tent. So your tent appears to like mushroom up and then fall down on the sides as the glacier melts around it. So anything like rocks, you can find big rocks that have a pillar of ice underneath them. And there'll be this balanced rock on top of it, some of them the size of a house. They're sitting on a pillar of ice that hasn't melted. And as I walked up to find out where our water source, there was a human torso that was sitting on this pillar. No arms, no legs, no head, no clothes, just sort of a leathery torso that was sitting on this pillar and sort of melting into our drinking water. And we had been drinking this water. So I, picked it up and got it out of the drinking water. It's like makes me choke a little bit, the process, because I remember it was pretty nasty, and put it in a crevasse. So I mean, that kind of thing is what you experience when you're on some of those hardest mountains in the world. There are body parts lying everywhere. I can't think of a sport on earth where, where you're going to competition to a game or anything. You're walking past the body parts of the people that have gone before you. And if a lot of people, that's tough. That's tough for a lot of people.
That the only thing I could really say about that is fucked. That's completely fucked up, man. Do you feel like there's any like mental side effects and like serious mental repercussions from going through that many, experiences with dead bodies?
Yeah, dead bodies and also my partners. So I've lost most of the guys that I've climbed with in the past. I would say most of my primary partners are now gone. People that I've shared a rope with at some point, or at least base camp. I think right now 26. I've lost 26 people that I've shared a rope with or base camp with. That's a lot of people, and a lot of those men and some women I was very close to, very good friends, and sometimes partners that I was climbing with. So, here's the thing that I think I'm going to lose some of your people that might be listening to this, because this is a tough thing, and I explore this in my mind because it's not something you can avoid mentally. I have dreams, I have some very violent visuals that are hard to get rid of in your mind, including the one that I mentioned earlier. These are tough moments, but if you travel overseas and you go to different cultures, people deal with death differently in different cultures. And in some cultures, not just ones that are like heavily spiritual cultures, but I just mean like social culture. Death in other countries is seen quite differently. And you want to talk about fear. That's our ultimate fear, right? None of us want to die. And I don't want to die either. And but in some other cultures, death is not as emotionalized as it is in our culture. And so we see it as such we have such an incredible emotional response to death. But yet death is actually the only thing that is inevitable. And it seems like a cliche to say that, but it's actually true. It is actually our most human experience, because it's the only thing that is absolutely assured once we are alive. Everything else is a maybe. Yet we project on it this emotional thing like it is the most unnatural thing. And so we have this, we look at it as the most unnatural thing that can happen in your life. Oh my goodness, that person died. How untimely, how tragic. Yet it's inevitable for every single one. It is our most human experience, is to die. It's the only thing that every single person has in common once we're alive. Everything else is a maybe at that point. So I've looked at other cultures and I looked at their response to it, and we just, sometimes just like freak out over the concept. Yet in a lot of other cultures, death is a daily occurrence in many other cultures around the world. People look at it differently than we do.
Yeah. So do you feel like being exposed to these different cultures more frequently has helped you have a better relationship with essentially your potential demise at some point?
No, I think many people, so for example, the fear of many people have never seen a dead body in their life. Maybe they've seen a grandparent or somebody die. They've been to a funeral and seen sort of this forgive me for saying, but a flowery presentation of it, not the violence of death, or not the actual death itself. So we don't really experience that. But when I'm a search and rescue tech, and I've worked a lot of rescues and done quite a bit of body recoveries aside from my climbing. And there are a lot of workers in the world. A lot of people work in hospitals. A lot of people who work in in the medical fields, police officers, and these soldiers. But people see death a lot, and when you see it, it doesn't make a death less tragic, but what it does is it changes your response to it, your fear response to it. It's a natural occurrence. It is an absolute natural thing. And when you can take that sting out of it in terms of fear, and when you can remove, sure, be emotional. And of course, I've spent many days and nights agonizing over some of the deaths that I've been very close to, because they've been friends and partners at the same time. But I don't look at it as a untimely and unnatural occurrence. I'll miss that person. I miss my friend, miss a family member, but it is not untimely. It is actually timely. It is, and then you can accept it. If you look at it as something that's unacceptable, the most inevitable thing in life is unacceptable. I think that that's an uphill battle mentally. So once you realize your mortality, and once we realize that that we're all going to die at some point, it does take the fear away from it. And much of our fear is related to that moment, right? Much of our fear is related to that moment.
Yeah, essentially the unknown, right? That's one of the things that people fear so much, is just not having control.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we've been talking about death for quite a while now, so let's pivot. Let's talk about something a little bit more exciting and, on a different path. Let's talk about the athletics.
Yeah.
So, as you're mentioning, being an alpinist, like that's a completely different field of athleticism, right? Like you have high level football players, hockey players, you have endurance athletes who compete in triathlons. And then you have alpinists, which almost seem to be on their completely different level, simply because you have the oxygen that you're going to have to, the lack of oxygen that you're going to have to kind of work around. You have the insane height that you're climbing. So obviously that's like a physical feat that is super challenging. But then you also have the mental capacity there too, right? Like fighting fear, overcoming obstacles, solving problems, dealing with stress, and still performing, right? So I've heard you say that high-level athletes, and many high-level athletes that have no bank. So that's your words, no bank. Can you explain what that means and essentially where you came from that?
Yeah, sure. So when I was first starting to climb, I remember going to Mount Whitney with my brother. Mount Whitney is the highest mountain in the lower 48, and we were trying to climb this mountain. It took us 10 days. Now I can run it in a couple of hours, but back then I think we did 10 days to try to climb this mountain. We never even summited back then. And we were in the parking lot after getting ready to go home, and I saw a guy with a shirt that said Aconcagua, and Aconcagua is the highest mountain in the world outside of the Himalayas. It's in South America. And I was so impressed that this guy had an Aconcagua t-shirt on. And I asked him if he'd been on Aconcagua. He said yes, but he wasn't able to climb it, but his wife had climbed it. And so I was I was so impressed by him even having been on this mountain. So we always look to people that have more experience than us, that are one level higher, whether it's, you look at hockey, it has so many levels, and you finally get up to the NHL. But you look at the person who's able, junior C or whatever, the next level higher, and we admire those people, and we think, wow, they're accomplished. And when I get that accomplished, I'm also going to feel accomplished. But what happens when we feel accomplished is that I have found with myself and other elite athletes, I don't want to call myself an elite athlete, but I certainly try to be one. But I know elite athletes, and the one thing that I find really common is that they're extremely dissatisfied, and that dissatisfaction comes by not banking on our accomplishments. So, you think that that person, I would have thought earlier on that that person who was wearing the Aconcagua t-shirt would walk around feeling like, yeah, I'm kind of a badass climber. But when I walk around feeling, I walk around in daily life, I don't think I've ever climbed a mountain in my life. And I'm only reminded of it when we have conversations or somebody comes up to me and says, oh, you've climbed this and you've climbed that. I don't remember it. I'm looking forward. So, and I'm forward focused always. The stuff that has gone behind me, it doesn't matter whether it's K2 or Everest or Annapurna or a gold medal, it's gone. It doesn't go into a bank and then therefore contribute to my psyche that makes me walk around feeling accomplished. No, I'm always hungry. I have this constant hunger, and I always actually internally feel that I'm not accomplished. Maybe that's like some kind of crazy, deficit, maybe some mental deficit or something like that. Maybe it's unhealthy. I'm not saying it's healthy or unhealthy. All I'm saying is that I find that having no bank is what continually, this sense that I haven't really accomplished anything is what continually pushes me forward. I mean, there's a certain amount of dissatisfaction that successful people have, and usually.
What is up, Beyond Movers? I just wanted to hop in here quickly to say that I'm so stoked that you're listening in on this conversation. I always do my best to pull interesting and powerful information from my guests to give you an opportunity to learn from the best. If you're enjoying this episode of Beyond Movement, I would love to hear what you think, and it would mean the world to me if you would leave an honest review. Tell us what you're enjoying, what you think, and I will continue to bring you the greatest minds that I can get my hands on. Don't forget to take a screenshot and post this in your Instagram stories and tag us at matthew.j.philly and beyondmovement.project so we know you're listening in. Okay, so let's get back to this conversation. And as always, let's go.
Some of the most successful people in business, are they don't feel successful. In sports, that's certainly the same.
Yeah. So my next question was essentially what you're saying is always hungry, never satisfied, really, and never really carrying like your accomplishments on your shoulders, making you feel entitled in any way. Always hungry, right?
Right.
So my next question was actually, you've kind of touched on it. Do you feel like this is a trait that many successful people have?
Yeah, I do. When I know a lot of cyclists, a lot of triathletes, and have had some exposure to some of the top triathletes, some minimal exposure, but trained alongside with some of the top triathletes in the world, for example. I cycle as a road biking is sort of my main aerobic endurance sport in terms of training, just because you can log so many hours training your aerobic engine without the impact of being on your feet. I just couldn't log that many hours on my feet and still have knees and ankles and things like that. So plus I find I just really enjoy cycling. And it just seems that it's just really common, and this comes from like, it transcends a sport and kind of it kind of spills over into your life as well. A lot of the athletes that I know are kind of restless people who somehow feel what I have defined as an illusion, really, is that once I get to this point, then I'll feel satisfied. It's like, think once I climb this mountain, then I'm going to feel like I've really been there, like I've accomplished something. But those people quit. I mean, those people give up. I don't know why Lance Armstrong, how many Tour de France, jerseys did he have hanging on his wall? Yet, no, can't hang it up. Got to go back and try one more time. And there's something that still drives a person, because as soon as you lose that drive, then you just quit. I've got enough money in the bank. I'm a successful business person. I'm just going to move to a beach somewhere and, hang it up. People who are successful in business, I find the same thing. No, more. And I think that can be two things. I think it could be greed, a greed of accomplishment, but I also do think that that almost all of us experience that at some level. Almost all of us. Whether that's my yard has to be perfectly manicured. The lifestyle obsession of creating a home. Oh, now our home is great. Now we'll go buy a bigger home. It's just, there's never really that moment of sitting back and saying, "Well, I'm really satisfied." There's a continual push for there's more, and there's more. And those people who have that deep empty hole and no bank, man, they just keep pushing and pushing. So I'm not saying it's the healthiest trait in the world. As a matter of fact, I don't think it's healthy at all. I'm talking about it, but it's certainly common with accomplished people, in my opinion.
Yeah, it might not be healthy, but it definitely seems helpful.
Yeah. For sure.
In pursuing big lofty goals, right? Now, you were mentioning and you brought up Lance Armstrong. So on the topic, related to supplementation, you were mentioning, it's funny that I said Lance Armstrong and that makes me think of supplementation, but you were mentioning you summited K2 with no supplemental oxygen. Can you tell me, is this something that's common in your sport, and why do you choose not to supplement with oxygen? Just clarify for me.
It's cheating. and I'll tell you why it's cheating. It's because instead of climbing to the summit without supplemental oxygen, just pitting yourself against the mountain, what you're doing is you're bringing the summit down to your ability. And if any of us looked at business or sport in that regard, let's make the sport easier as opposed to pushing the limits of human possibility. That's why, in one sense, you do have some very few people in terms of the entire high altitude climbing community. Very few people are really pushing those limits, these alpinists. There are guys out there, men and women out there, that are doing this. But most of the people, the crowds that you see, are cheating. They're bringing the altitude down to their ability, and they're doing it by using supplemental oxygen. Because once you go on supplemental oxygen, you're creating an artificial altitude in an artificial environment. You look at triathletes, they're getting stronger as individuals. They're getting faster. They're getting more efficient. They're training harder. And so their times are coming down, but their times are not coming down because they're making the races easier. And what makes Everest, for example, let's just use Everest because everyone knows Everest. What makes Everest so hard to climb? Is it from top to bottom? Is it the highest mountain in the world? No, actually. From top to bottom, just as a structure above the ground level, if you zero out the bottom of Everest to the top of it, it's not the biggest mountain in the world. It's just the highest above sea level. It's the highest elevation, right? So what makes that mountain distinctive is its elevation, not its size, top to bottom. I mean, like Hawaii, Mauna Kea, Mauna Loa, they start at the ocean and go to 13,000, 14,000 feet. They're bigger than Everest as a mountain from top to bottom. So if you look at Everest and then you say, let's climb to the highest elevation, but we'll go on supplemental oxygen and bring the physiological experience of being on the summit of Everest down to 15, 16, 17,000 feet above sea level by putting on a mask and scuba diving. What's the point? I mean, it's not pushing the limits. It's not hitting yourself against a mountain saying, how far can I go? And I'll be satisfied with that. These people are saying, I cannot make it to the summit. Excuse me. They're saying, I cannot make it to the summit on my own, so I'll bring the summit down to my ability. And they're doing it en masse. They're doing it without cutting their teeth in the lower mountains, pushing themselves over years of being self-sufficient. They're hiring guides and Sherpas. And I don't know if you know this, but you know that people who climb Everest now don't even take an ice tool to the summit. They don't even use an ice axe or an ice tool. And the reason for that is there's a rope that goes from the bottom of the mountain to the top, and you slide a device up that rope called an ascender, and it won't slide down. and that rope has not one gap, not even that big. It goes all the way to the summit. So have you ever asked yourself, have you seen the pictures of the lines on Everest?
Of the what, sorry?
The lines, the big lines of people that are all lined up.
Yeah, actually, in researching you, I was looking up more into summiting big mountains, and yeah, I've definitely seen photos of that.
Yeah. So why is there a traffic jam? Why is there a line of people? You have this massive mountain. Why don't people just spread out, right, and climb, on different routes? Why is that? Ask yourself. And it's because they're all on one rope, and people don't have the requisite skills to unclip from that rope and climb around the slower person in front of them. So they're all just in this big conga line. That is why the lines exist on Everest, is because people are literally learning to climb in base camp, paying guides, paying groups, local Nepali Sherpas to carry all their gear for them, set up their tents, make food for them, carry their oxygen for them. So now they're at a artificial elevation and climbing simply a rope. If you have zero climbing experience and you're moderately fit and you have the money to pay for it, you can go climb Everest. Under those circumstances, in that commercial guided circumstances. So this, as the oxygen delivery systems get more efficient, that summit is coming down farther and farther. And I think I was sharing with you that the research that was done by Tom Hornbein, the Hornbein Couloir, is on the north face of Everest, and Tom Hornbein was on the expedition, first American expedition to the North Face in 1963. And they did a bunch of research, and they found out that, standing on the summit of Everest using supplemental oxygen in those inefficient delivery systems of today, now they're super efficient oxygen delivery systems, those heavy, inefficient 1960s delivery systems, that if you're standing on the summit of Everest and you're crank it up to 4 liters a minute and you're standing there, the equivalent is lower than the highest mountain in America without oxygen, less than 4,000 meters. Talking like 13,000 feet above sea level. So I think high altitude mountaineering, I'll say, is the only sport in the world that's going backwards that I can know. Everything else, people are getting stronger, they're getting fitter, they're getting faster. And here we're just bringing the summit down lower and lower to people's accomplishment. And I don't understand this thinking. Why wouldn't I see how far I can go on my own? Self-sufficient climb, walk up to the mountain, just you and the mountain, you and your friends in the mountain, just see how far you can get. And if you can't make the summit, you're satisfied with that. But the high altitude world, the commercial world of high altitude mountaineering is we're going the opposite direction. So that's why I categorically reject that whole commercialization of the mountains. And you're looking at, if you take away oxygen, you take away commercialism, you take away the masses, you take away all the environmental impact, you take away all the hanging ropes, all the garbage, and you reduce it to people who have cut their teeth on lower mountains. And Everest, instead of becoming a bucket list item, becomes the pinnacle of a life spent achieving through apprenticeship and self-sufficiency, which it used to be, but not anymore.
Right. So going back, from your words, you mentioned that supplemental oxygen is cheating. Now that sounds like it's coming from a sense that do you feel like people who use supplemental oxygen are taking away from the efforts that you and others have put in? Or if you look at it from a perspective of they're going for the experience, right? Like they want to reach the summit and be able to experience and have that journey. Now, excuse me if this question is kind of unclear. I'm not exactly positive how I want to word it, but it seems clear in my mind. Do you feel like, how how can I mention this? So they're after the experience, the journey. That's what they want. They want the summit. They want the ultimate peak. Now, you seem very passionate about not using supplemental oxygen. Now, is this because you feel like the experience should come from the ultimate effort of doing it unaided? Or do you feel, again, like it's coming from, given all the drastic experiences that you've had with partners dying and such, and almost like is there a sense that you feel like it's mocking the sport?
I don't really feel like it's mocking the sport. In one sense, and I think I should really be clear about this, in one sense, who am I to judge anybody else's accomplishments and achievements? I mean, if somebody wants to use oxygen, that's fine. Although we do look down upon doping, and in any sport, we look down upon doping. Well, oxygen requires a prescription from a doctor. It is a drug. It's a listed drug. You can't, use supplemental oxygen in a sport. It is a drug, and it is the only drug that's showed to be performance enhancing at high altitude. Not just that it creates an artificial elevation, an artificial atmosphere for you. It is a drug, and so if you look at it in that regard, I think in any sport we would really. Most people would really disagree with performance enhancing drugs. So from that perspective, you can look at it if you're looking at mountaineering as a sport. Now, if you're looking at it just as an adventure, and someone's saying, well, I just want to, well, then why don't we just go with what the Chinese have been playing with in terms of an idea of just putting a gondola to the summit of Everest. That's probably something they'll do eventually. I mean, I've heard rumors, and I don't know if they're true or not, but they've already built a road to the north side of Everest on the Chinese side. There's a paved road that goes to base camp. Paved.
That's incredible that they've actually managed to do that.
Yeah. So if you want to go to, a lot of people go to Everest,
they
on
just
the north,
drive
on
to
the
base
north
camp.
side, they just just hire a taxi and drive over there. I mean,
call an Uber,
ride their bikes there. It's the next thing is the gondola. So yeah, if you want the experience of being up there, and I mean, who am I to criticize somebody else's experience? But if you want to look at the sport of climbing, and for me, it really doesn't affect me in this way. If I want to take on Everest, and I have been on Everest, but I didn't summit. If I want to take on Everest and really push to the summit and go to the summit without oxygen and take on one of the harder, I don't have to follow everybody else. I can go whichever way I want, right? And then fail, or succeed. I would rather I look at mountains in that regard. I look at sports in that regard. Like, I'm going to pit myself against this objective, and I'm going to see how far I go. And if I can't do it, so be it. That's my limit. And unfortunately, in climbing at high altitude without oxygen, that limit sometimes has pretty steep consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. Life or death, right?
There's have you heard people talk about the death zone?
Yes.
Yeah. So people talk about the death zone. It's like 8,000 meters, 26,500 feet. But the death zone is really about 6,200 meters, about 20,000 feet. So once you climb through that window, the human body cannot live indefinitely above 6,200 meters. You're on a downward trajectory at that point physiologically. You can't take in enough oxygen. And the higher you go, the steeper that curve gets. And it just so happens that once you climb through 8,000 meters, there's 14 mountains in the world that are over 8,000 meters. It's just an arbitrary distinction, like a 14er. So, but once you climb through 8,000 meters, that curve gets really steep. And you're on the scale is logarithmic too. It's not linear. So the difference between 4,000 and 4,100 meters is way different than 8,100 meters. That 100 meters that high, it goes up exponentially, right? So once you climb through 8,000 meters, I think it was Greg Child who talked about, so you climb to that window, and you've got to get back down through that window before it shuts. And so you just have limited time. This is without supplemental oxygen, right? So you're on you're dying. You are literally physically dying at that altitude. You got to get back down.
Yeah, that's a crazy metaphor and way to put that into perspective. You got to get back out of that window before it closes.
Yeah.
That makes it pretty horrifying, even though it is like a horrifying concept, obviously. But how long would you say when you're up there that you have, like, before you literally just need to start descending?
Well, it depends. It depends on the person. It depends on a lot of things. It's variable. So I was on Annapurna in 2008. Annapurna has been my nemesis. I tried Annapurna 6 times, 6 different expeditions over 13 years. And 6 of the guys that I've climbed with on Everest are gone now. So actual partners. And so, and I finally climbed it last year. And there's a video from the summit of me talking with a guy named Nims Dai, who's a very good friend of mine. A badass, just a coolest dude, and he's a Nepali guy, and he also in the SAS. He's just like super interesting guy, and he just climbed all 14 8,000 meters in 1 year on supplemental oxygen with like all of his team and fixing the ropes and everything, like this big huge infrastructure, right? So we were on the summit, and there's video of us on the summit of Annapurna, and you can hear him. He says, can you talk to me if you have a good head? And then at the end of because he's asking about my mental capacity at that point, because they're all on oxygen, I'm the only one who's not. And then before the end of the video, you can hear him say, okay, brother, you need to start going down, because everybody's worried about me in my hypoxic state, being at that elevation without supplemental oxygen. Everyone knows I'm on the clock, but they're on the clock too. If they run out of oxygen, now all of a sudden it's like scuba diving, someone pulled the plug, right? Now you're in real serious trouble. And that's why people die. That's why a man did die, we think, who was on, I'm not exactly sure. I can't say why. I know why he died. He died of hypothermia, but he stopped moving because I think he ran out of oxygen. I'm not sure about that, but that happens a lot. People run out of oxygen, and then you're in real trouble, right? Because now all of a sudden you have an acute exposure to high altitude, as opposed to the body going through the physiological changes of acclimatization. And you have 2 things, right? So everybody has acclimatization. You think to answer your question before, how long do you have? Everybody has some ability to make physiological adaptations to exposure to altitude. We call that acclimatization, right? So if you went right now to the summit of Everest, you would be dead in 10 minutes. So how can somebody climb up there? Your body goes through adaptations. Mainly your hematocrit increases, your red blood cell count goes up, and you can carry more oxygen, a lot of enzymatic changes and things like that. So everybody has a scale, is on a spectrum. Some people acclimatize well. Some people don't acclimatize at all. They go to Aspen in Colorado from Texas, and they die at that just by flying to Aspen at the bottom of the mountain. That does occur. Happens every year. So everybody, but most people are somewhere in the middle of that. And I happen to be on the very extreme other end of that, where I can acclimatize to extreme altitudes. So you have that, and then you have this other consideration, which is your body's tolerance to being exposed to extreme altitudes. That's another thing, a person's tolerance. And I happen to have, just through experience, there's only one way to find out, is just to go try it. I also happen to have high level of tolerance, and a very small amount of people in the world have both that ability. There are very few. There's only a certain amount of people who have the physiological ability to be at that altitude without supplemental oxygen. So, but it's also one of those crazy things that's variable.
Right.
It has to do with, maybe you're not hydrated, maybe you haven't slept enough, maybe you haven't, maybe you have you're hyponatremic. Your enzymatic processes are are skewed. Maybe, you have a little bit of asthma, or, you've got a chest infection that you don't know about, that, low level chest infection. And then all of a sudden, like Inaki Ochoa, my partner on Annapurna in 2008, who has been to 8,000 meters 18 times and then dies of exposure to altitude at below 8,000 meters, that's 7,500. So,
Wow. So
yeah.
let's back up a little bit on the topic of doping.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you feel like the sport is actually moving backwards, which is, you don't see that often. Most sports at this point are progressing in some way, right?
Yeah.
As you said, people are getting faster, people are getting more talented, skill levels are increasing. You feel like,
Training.
alpinism is declining.
Yeah.
And yesterday, when we were having a quick call, you were mentioning that there was some things you wanted to chat about that was happening in Russia. I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, actually, that's it's a little bit different. That's not really what's happening. That it's not really about the sport declining. My Russian experience was a little bit different.
Okay, so they're not related.
Yeah,
Okay.
they're not. Russia, Russia's. I don't even know how to talk about Russia really. So Elbrus is in Russia, and a lot of people don't know, but the highest mountain in Europe is Elbrus. But Elbrus is in Russia, but it's still considered the highest mountain in Europe. So I think it was 2017. A police officer from Littleton, Colorado, went to Elbrus to climb Elbrus alone. And I was living in France at the time. I was cycling and training for a speed record on Mont Blanc, one of the ultra hurt records on Mont Blanc. And I got a call, and actually a lot of people called me and contacted me on social media and said, "Hey, this guy, his name's Stephen Bear, this police officer and a military serviceman, had gone missing in Russia." Now, Elbrus is in the Caucasus. It's on the Georgia border. A really kind of a hotbed. Chechnya is nearby, Dagestan. It's just like a pretty volatile, historically volatile area between Russia on the borders, and has been closed sometimes, but it happened to be open. And so I essentially agreed to go to Russia to try to find Stephen Bear. So sometimes I'll get calls from people to say, "Hey, can you take your search and rescue experience?" I'm a incident command coordinator, been trained, and a rescue medic, EMT. And so I decided, okay, I'll go. And through this like crazy process working with the U.S. State Department, and you got to remember, this is like 2017. So it was like the height of this investigation between Trump and Russia, and everybody was like, Russia is the enemy, and people were going crazy about Russia at the time. And here I am, this American. I have a dual citizen. I have even though I'm proud Canadian, born and raised, I have an American passport. So I was traveling to France on an American passport. So you're gonna send this U.S. citizen to a hotbed on the border of Georgia to look for a missing police military guy in 2017. So they had raised a bunch of money. I worked with the State Department. The State Department got me a visa into the country. And when I got there, I mean, I was the FSB is like the former KGB. Mm-hmm. You call it the FSB now. They made it like really obvious that they were watching me. I mean, they were offering me rides and things like that, and I was actually pretty heavily interviewed by them. Let's just say interviewed by them at one point, and ended up trying to find, in an attempt to try to find Stephen Bear possibly alive. At this point, chances by the time I got there, chances of him being alive were pretty slim. Anyway, ended up renting helicopters. Really creating my own sort of rescue project there. And I just, tell people, like, look, imagine if a Russian man came to the United States, hired a bunch of helicopters, and was just like flying around, some military bases and things. I just don't think that they'll go over very well.
Not well at all.
But I mean, people talk about it because the craziest thing is I didn't end up finding him. I've been there 3 times since, still searching for his body. But I ended up finding 5 other people. It was, yeah, it was like super crazy. There's a television show that'll be coming out about it. You can check it out. It's like pretty cool. But I ended up finding some people. One woman had been missing since like 1991, and 3 Ukrainian climbers who went missing with 6 Ukrainian climbers on the mountain, and found them completely intact. Like they had skin tone. They had died, were frozen to death near the summit. And when we uncovered them, like found them by just this like crazy searching techniques that we use that hadn't been employed on that mountain before, and found these guys, and then found a camera with them, and ended up pulling 32 pictures from this film camera and they've been missing since 2002. So this is absolutely nuts. And now, now going back to Russia, I want to go back one more time and actually try to look for Stephen Bear still. But I know you don't have the time on this show, but you'll have to hear that story at some point, because let's just say, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm pretty sure that he died on the mountain, but there's some really disturbing information that maybe there's a small percentage chance that he's not on that mountain. Like I received information, like there's phone calls that came in that were made on his phone a few days later, and coordinates that were mysteriously sent to me on my phone by Russian intelligence, and it was a nutty experience.
Man, you got me so curious right now. Like, you're right. We need to kind of respect the time, but yeah. I'm definitely extremely curious about this story, and definitely something I want to kind of dive in a little bit deeper. And you know what? Let's kind of leave it up to the audience too. Like, if they want to hear this story, let's get you back on here, and let's dive in a little bit deeper to maybe some of your experiences, because I think you have tons of crazy stories that I would personally love to hear a little bit more on.
Oh yeah, I could share with you some video too, but this story is like, it's nuts. I mean, I've never been. I think I'm almost positive that I was being surveilled by both the United States, and I know I was by the Russians, because they just told me. They just, right. Yeah, they met with me, specifically, and said, "Hey, look, we're watching everything you do." But by the end of it, I was working with the local FSB, which is a government, or I'm sorry, the MCS, which is a government rescue agency. And some of those guys have become really good friends of mine since then. And it's kind of a crazy story, and I'll just leave it with this, is that the theme of that story to me is, despite what people think, you have all this like government craziness that goes on, at a high level. But when it comes down to like people and just meeting other people and dealing with people, the majority of people in this world are good, solid people who just want helpful, who are friendly. And man, the people that I met in Russia, man, some of the most incredible, courageous, heroic guys that I've ever met, I met in the Caucasus region of Russia. Just fantastic. At the same time, there's this thing that follows me around, and I just, where's Stephen Bear?
Yeah, absolutely. So you were talking about meeting people, and your experiences, your sport, and what you do, it gives you an opportunity to meet a lot of different people from a lot of different walks of life, a lot of different backgrounds, experiences. So can you tell me about a time when you first met this would have been early on in your alpinist career, when you first met your mountaineering or alpinist idols? What was that like for you?
When I first met my my mountaineering idealist, you said?
Idols. So
Idols.
yeah.
Idols. I think I I'm trying to think. There are times when I've really been isolated from the climbing community a lot, and I think I was on Kanchenjunga, which is the third highest mountain in the world, a few years ago, and there was a woman who was part of the Canadian Alpine Club of Canada there, and she says, why aren't you involved in the climbing community? She'd asked me that, why are you not? Arguably one of the more accomplished, at least in high altitude, Canadian climbers, but not involved in the community. So I've always been an outlier in the community, and have done so, I can tell you honestly, out of insecurity. That's why I'm along with dissatisfaction goes insecurity hand in hand. So
can you dive a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah, I can. I'll answer your question though. I didn't really meet any climbers that were my idols until 2009, and I met almost all of them in one shot. And I mentioned Inaki Atroa, who had been to altitude like 18 times and then finally died on our expedition in 2008. I just did a interview last week with Spanish radio about Inaki Achoa. He was one of the more famous climbers in the world at the time. And through that, I ended up meeting the top climbers in the world, for arguably Uli Steck, Alexei Bolotov, Dennis Aruko, who I just was on Broad Peak in winter with, and K2 in Broad Peak in winter with just a few months ago. The top guys at the time. And then through that, we were awarded the Pile d'Or, is like the Oscars of high altitude climbing or alpine climbing in France every year. And so I went to that and I met Reinhold Messner. I met Peter Habler. I met Reinhold, not there, but somewhere else, but Peter Habler and Doug Scott, and some of the most famous climbers that I grew up. And I just remember being there. I felt so inadequate. I felt so like I shouldn't be there. That whole fake syndrome that you feel like you're
imposter syndrome.
Yeah,
That's
exactly. I definitely felt that there. It's really funny. Like there's video of that ceremony, and how they have everybody on stage, and then they have the big screen behind you, so the people sitting way back in the auditorium can see everything. And I have still photos that my girlfriend at the time had taken, and all you can see is me on stage, but a big picture of my head, because the whole screen behind me is a close-up. It's just my head, and I'm wiping sweat off my forehead. Talk about terrifying. Like all the things I've done, that's one of the most terrifying moments of my life, to be there out of all the climbing and everything else. And I'm like freaking out, and I'm literally holding this award in front of me on stage, and I'm thinking, don't pass out. Don't pass out. Don't pass out. I thought I was going to pass out on stage. And can you imagine what if I felt inadequate, like about my climbing career, how would I feel like if I went to the Pile d'Or, like the Oscars climbing, to receive this award that's only been given out once in the history of the award. And now I'm going to pass out on stage holding this thing.
Yeah. How fitting.
That was a terror. I hated that moment.
That's kind of funny, man. Like, again, you've climbed some of the tallest mountains multiple times, and here you are in front of a crowd, and you're shitting your pants.
Yeah, I was seriously terrified. I hate being in front of people. Same thing, the Banff Mountain Film Festival, the famous Banff film.
Yeah.
A few years later, I think it was maybe like 2 years later, I was asked to be on the jury, right? So I was on the jury, and one guy was on the jury. He'd won an Oscar for the soundtrack of the Lord of the Rings, film series. And, all these people who were on the jury who deserved to be on the jury. And I was like the token climber dude, just, and I remember being at the film festival and watching all the films. And then somehow I advocated for the film that eventually won That was when we had the round table at the end, and because I had advocated amongst the jury for this film, they thought, well, you should be the one to give the award away on stage. And I was like, no, that's like, please, no. And I remember drinking about 3 or 4 glasses of wine before I got on stage. I was like trying to soften the blow, and then I remember we were going through rehearsals, and I was like, all the jury members were going to stand here, and I thought, I said to the director, I think it's going to be really odd that we're standing. It will look more comfortable if we're sitting, because I don't want to pass out standing.
That's so fun.
That it would be more natural for us to be sitting, so they brought chairs, and I was like, thank God. And I swear, when I was standing in front of all those people and all the lights on me, I think they could see my heart beating through my shirt. That's what I was nervous. That the whole first 10 rows could literally see my shirt moving. My heart was beating so bad. I was absolutely terrified. Absolutely hated that moment. So since then I've been asked to be on a few different juries and come and present, and I'm like, man, I don't want to stand in front of people.
That's your limit. That's so funny. I mean, that's so funny, man. Like, that's your limit. You'll just say no.
Yeah, I'll say no. I have since. That was the last thing I did. I've done lectures since then, because now when I'm doing lectures, you can talk about your thing, right? I mean, if I'm talking about my thing, then I'm much more comfortable like this. Right. But you want me to talk about something that's not my thing or make a presentation, forget it. I'll pass out on stage.
That's wild, man. Completely wild. So, seeing that let's go back to the experiences you've had, like, in your sport. You've, I don't know how many 8,000 meters, 8,000 meter summits that you've been to or have attempted. How many would that be?
20. Well, 8,000, I'm not sure, but I've been on Himalayan expeditions 21 now, 21
times. So you're extremely experienced. You're successful as a hiker, alpinist. You have countless journeys in this sport. What do you do to keep, what's on top of your mind to keep improving? Like, what's next for you right now?
Next, well, we just came from Broad Peak K2 attempt in winter, was unsuccessful, but that really K2 in winter is kind of seen as one of the last great problems in the mountains in this world. Whoever bags that, it's just a historic achievement, landmark achievement, really, in mountaineering. And then I think that I'd also really like to take a shot at the speed record on the north side of Everest. I think I have a really good shot just based on my performance these last 2 years and how fast I can climb without oxygen. I think I have a shot at setting that record. So I'd really like to take a poke at that next year. And then I've got some objectives in Pakistan in the Karakoram range, which is just a gnarly region, beautiful area of the world, just incredible place, northern Pakistan. And so my partner Lotta is a Finnish climber, and we want to take on the French route on G2 next year, Gasherbrum 2. So it's kind of a combination of things which I'm passionate about and things which are commercially viable. And the Everest speed record is what I call a commercially viable project, so I can put food on the table. But at the same time, because it's an athletic event, it's along the lines of this ultra hurt type of project in terms of a speed record. I think it's really pushing the limits of what's possible at altitude, because that's pretty tough. It's 16 hours right now is the record, about 16 hours.
That's wild. Now, real quick, because we're running real short on time at this point, real quick, you've mentioned ultra hurt multiple times. So break that down for us, because again, I've never heard of this. You gave me a brief description of it yesterday when we had our first conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Please break that down for the audience, because what is that? It sounds terrible.
Yeah, it's a sufferfest for sure.
Yeah.
So it's the basic concept is human powered. highest to low or lowest to highest. So, for example, from the lowest point in United States, which is Badwater in Death Valley, it's about 300 feet below sea level, to the highest point in the lower 48, which is Mount Whitney, which is 14,500 feet, over 3 passes, all human powered. So bike to the bottom, and then run, and then climb, all in a single push. And so I first started doing these, well, back in like 2012, I think was the first one. And it was just to see how, to do the most extreme, all by human powered. So I think the first time I did was like 19 hours or something. And it's 23,000 feet of climbing total in a day, and 147 miles, total. So it's just a lesson in suffering, which is why it's called ultra hurt. It's just absolutely brutal. It's kind of like a duathlon, an ultra duathlon bike run sport. And so I've tried to encourage people, and also there's a group of people now doing these, like, for example, from like Aspen to the highest mountain in Colorado, from the ocean to Baldy, which is in LA, ocean to San Gorgonio, and now the lowest point in Colorado to the highest point in Colorado. It's just taking climbing to a whole another level into ultra endurance sports, through the bike run. And they're just, every time I do one, I just really question my sanity. Like every time I'm halfway through, I just think this is just stupid. There's just no point to this. but I guess it's the same thing on an expedition. I always say, it's not a real expedition until you ask yourself, why you're doing this at least once. So
yeah, again, a total sufferfest, right? Like, so so the biggest difference between like an ultra duathlon versus ultra hurt is the altitude. You're going from lowest to highest point.
Gain. Oftentimes it's like elevation gain. I also did one like in Hawaii on that mountain I mentioned earlier. It's like starting at the ocean and going to the top, biking and then running. But really, there's a lot of really cool ones that people take on now, that I've heard that people are doing this where they're just doing it locally. So they're saying, okay, from this point to this point, okay, let's go climb this mountain, but we're going to start in Banff, so we're going to ride our bike out there, and then we're going to get to the top as fast as possible. So I just, because there's so much opportunity for people to do this, like the highest point in the province or the highest point in the state, in some of these states, it's only, 1,500 meters or 2,000 meters or something. But if they start, say at a lake or something like that, a lot of the local ones can be like super achievable. They take 2 or 3 hours to do, or an extreme that can take 2 or 3 days to do, but the point is just being able to incorporate my training into something a little bit more interesting, and then give perspective. Like a lot of people, like Lotta, for example, she's in Finland right now, and she just did like the highest point in Finland. Most people do it in 5 days, or a lot of people do it. I don't know when most people do it, but a lot of people take 4 or 5 days to to hike all the way in, climb, and come back. And she just did it in 23 hours, just one straight, like foot mangling. Like her feet were just hamburger when she got back,
That's a great visual for sure. Her feet were just raw ground beef.
Yeah. And it's really, I think the concept is there, right? And the concept can be taken anywhere. That's what's really cool about it. Mm-hmm. So like anybody can go, all right, you know what? I'm going to go climb that mountain, but I'm going to start here. Or I'm going to go to that point, but I'm going to start here. And so really it's something that's super approachable for anybody to do. And at the same time, it gives context, like, to climb Whitney from Badwater it's just tough. It's so long, so long. And now it's crazy. Now I think someone just took the record. Yeah, I know somebody just took the record from me again. And he did it in 13 and a half hours. So now I'm going to go back next year and see if I can do it. And
just take that record right back.
Sub 13 hours, which is just, started at 24, so it's come down pretty crazy.
Yeah. All right, man. So I have one final question for you, and I like to ask this question to my guests because this is something that I feel like everyone has a different answer for, and this is one great way for me to pull awesome information from my guests that can really be tangible and helpful for myself and my audience. So, this is my favorite question. What do you feel separates high performers from those that don't achieve their goals? And I love the response that we get from this because it varies so crazy. So what do you feel like is one thing that separates high performers from those that don't achieve their goals?
One thing among
One thing.
others, like you just want
Yeah,
to.
your biggest thing that you feel is the top thing.
Yeah, no memory. And exposure to high altitude really must aid that in me. All the hypoxia that I've endured really contributes to that. But yeah, no memory. Forward thinking, always forward thinking. There's nothing from the past that exists, and I mean, it's a cliche, but it's forward thinking. And that's something I find I say a lot. I coach a couple of people and I've mentioned Lotta a few times, and she's really somebody that I spend a lot of time coaching as well. And I always thought, once it's finished, you move forward and you're forward thinking, because it's a very hopeful state. I usually find that my hardest moments personally, my most dissatisfying moments are when I'm thinking about the past. And when I'm comparing myself, when I'm drudging up things that I've been through, and when I'm most hopeful and most optimistic, I'm always thinking that I'm going to get better. So let's say I have training for the day and I set out and I do my training for the day and I don't quite complete my training for the day. Well, there's an opportunity to say, well, there you go, you loser. I mean, you failed in that. You haven't succeeded in that. But instead, my mentality is, you know what? That's okay because I'm going to do more next time, or I'm going to be stronger next time. So it's always forward thought, always forward thought, always forward thought. And because it's not just a cliche. I'm not trying to just, get over things from the past. I'm always thinking that's okay. Next time I'll do this. Next time I'll push harder. And it really helps with my failures. And failure is also, it's also reverse thought. Failure only has to do with things that are in the past. And if you look at my track record, I said I've been in 21 expeditions, but I certainly haven't succeeded 21 times. I probably have like a 30% success rate. I mean, if you want to come back from some of the endeavors that I take on, you have to have a low success rate because you can't push it too much. You talk about limits. In my sport, you have to be able to know yourself enough, be trained enough to push yourself up to the limit, but you cannot go over, because in my sport, when you go over your limits, you push yourself too hard, you don't come home. That's it. So there's a very fine line of actually knowing yourself really well, and being well equipped and well trained, and not pushing yourself through those limits. But at the same time, because of that, you end up failing, and you end up really quitting a lot and saying, well, I'm not really willing to push it because I want to live, I want to come back. So I deal with a lot of failure, but if I keep looking at, or be embarrassed for my failures, then it really drags me down. So I'm always saying, that's okay. I'm going to come back here and I'm going to do this. I'm going to come back and I'm going to do this. I'm going to train harder. I'm going to just forward thought. That would be mine.
I love it, man. So forward thinking, no memory. I love how you said no memory. So I feel like it's important to kind of clarify real quick that in terms of forward thinking, it's not, because essentially a lot of anxiety can come from focusing too much on the future events. So forward thinking in the sense that we're focused on goals, not necessarily events or situations that we're trying to obsessively control.
Yeah, well, control, I mean, is a whole nother subject, right? Forward thinking really has nothing to do with control. It just has. So
which is my point that I'm trying to clarify on here.
Yeah, I agree with you. And so I think no memory is better than forward thinking, right? I mean, no memory is probably more accurate, because we obviously have to we obviously have to plan ahead but I just think having no memory allows for more optimism.
Right.
It's just always saying, I may not have done it now, but I will do it tomorrow. Even if you fail tomorrow. And I think that's my perspective every day, to be honest. At the end of the day, I think, well, I didn't accomplish what I wanted to, but I have tomorrow. So the day's gone.
Yeah.
The day's gone.
Yeah, man, this was an unreal conversation. I feel like there's still so many unanswered questions that I want to pick your brain about.
Sure.
But again, I'd love to eventually get you back on here at some point, maybe after your next expedition, because I know you're a busy guy. But yeah, I'd love to hear what the audience has to say about that as well, because I'm sure they'd be very curious about some of these stories that you kind of left us with a cliffhanger. Pun intended there. But again, man, thank you so much for your time. This was awesome. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really hope you guys really enjoyed the conversation. So
appreciate it, brother.
Take care, man.
Hello. I wanted to say a huge thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to sit through this conversation with me. It's honestly my mission to bring you the greatest minds and pull some epic information from them to help you view your life through the lens of thought leaders and game changers. We're on a daily journey to be one step ahead of who we were yesterday, and I am excited to have you right here to walk this road with me. One of my goals is to help more people take control over their success and their daily lives. And one of the best ways to do this is with your reviews. This helps us rank the show to get it in front of more people. So if you enjoyed this episode and you have a quick moment, it would honestly mean the world to me if you would leave a review and comment about what you liked and maybe even who you want to see on the next show. Don't forget to put the tools you learned through this episode to practice, and I will see you next episode. Let's go.